One of the worst deals I've ever seen. The disastrous deal with Iran. One of the dumbest deals and one of the weakest contracts.
The people that negotiated that deal, namely Kerry and his friends, are incompetent.
One of the worst deals ever negotiated.
This is the history of Iran's nuclear program. In the 1950s, the Americans actually give Iran its first nuclear reactor. Back then, the West had a good relationship with Iran's leader, the Shah. Iran promises it only wants nuclear energy, but then Iran's enemy, Israel, acquires a nuclear weapon. All of a sudden, the Iranians start rethinking the whole not wanting a nuke thing. The Shah is overthrown in 1979 in the Islamic Revolution, and cooperation with the West on developing nuclear energy ends. At first, the new ruler, Ayatollah Khomeini, doesn't make a nuclear program much of a priority. In 1989, Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader who is still in charge today, comes to power and is more open than his predecessor to go for the bomb. By the mid-90s, it's clear to the Americans that Iran is quickly expanding its nuclear enrichment capabilities, even though they're telling the world they want a Middle East free of nukes. So, President Clinton begins sanctioning Iran by prohibiting any US entity from trading with the Iranians. A sanction, as defined by the Merriam-Webster dictionary, is an action that is taken or an order that is given to force a country to obey international laws. Fast forward to 2002, an opposition group within Iran reveals intelligence that the nuclear program is far more advanced than anyone thought. But American President George W. Bush pretty much ignores the emerging Iranian threat, because his administration is preoccupied with developing its campaign of lies to convince the world that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction, to justify its desired invasion and takedown of Saddam Hussein. In 2005, as a direct consequence of the American aggression in the region, the hyper-conservative Mahmoud Ahmadinejad becomes president of Iran. He defiantly calls for the expansion of Iran's nuclear program, calls for Israel to be wiped off the map, and calls the Holocaust a myth. The Israelis are now feeling threatened and growing impatient by the slow response to the Iran problem, so they begin planning an air attack against Iran's nuclear facilities. To his credit, Bush realizes this would create chaos, so he stops the Israelis from acting out their plans. But he also brings them in on a top-secret plan the Americans are almost ready to launch, called Olympic Games, a cyber attack operation targeting vulnerabilities in the security of the computer systems at Iran's most important nuclear facility. Then, the games begin. The centrifuges at Natanz start having a variety of problems, but the Iranian engineers at the plant have no idea they're under attack, as the breakdowns are designed to seem to them like random accidents. In 2009, President Obama takes office and chooses to continue Olympic Games at Bush's urging. But Obama also starts new, high-level talks with the Iranians, but progress on the diplomatic front is slow at first. The Iranians simply don't know what they're in for with Obama. The countries joining the Americans in talks are the 4 other permanent members of the UN Security Council: China, France, Russia, and the United Kingdom, plus Germany. This group is referred to as the P5+1 in international relations. Ahmadinejad wins re-election, but many Iranians think the vote is rigged and that Mir Hossein Mousavi is the real winner. Millions across the country hit the streets in protests that last 7 months. The government resorts to extreme violence and a crackdown on human rights. This Green Movement, as it's known, is the largest civil uprising in Iran since the revolution 30 years earlier that brought the current regime to power. More than 1,000 critical centrifuges proceed to fail at Iran's prized nuclear facility at Natanz, setting back the country's pursuit of a bomb by up to 2 years. Then, 2 Iranian nuclear scientists have their cars bombed. The Israelis are widely suspected. The Western alliance then cuts Iran off from the international financial system. The US goes further and blocks Iranian oil exports. The UN then reports it suspects Iran is developing parts for a nuclear warhead at a military base. Around this time, a stealth US spy drone crashes 140 miles inside Iran's border with Afghanistan. And a month later, another top Iranian nuclear scientist is assassinated. But Iran keeps increasing its uranium enrichment capabilities, even though it's now paying a high cost. It's losing $8 billion a month because the EU is now helping to make sure it can't deliver its most valuable commodity, oil, to market. Dozens of massive Iranian oil barges appear all along its coast, acting as holding containers while the government scrambles to build more storage facilities on land. In August, the UN reports an underground nuclear site deep inside a mountain, which makes it much harder for Iran's enemies to attack, is almost operational. More sanctions hit the Iranian banking sector, and the economy begins to buckle. Iran's currency, the rial, has dropped 40% in value. People now have to carry huge wads of cash just to buy bread and milk. But the government stubbornly declares it will install even more centrifuges that are much more powerful than what it currently has. Meanwhile, quality of life is continuing to deteriorate as the government loses confidence it can keep the cost of basic goods from skyrocketing even further. And there's a run on Iranian supermarkets as people try to buy up everything they can get their hands on. Around this time, John Kerry takes over for Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State, becoming the leading US negotiator with Iran. The situation is coming down to the wire, as the International Atomic Energy Agency reports Iran's nuclear program is dangerously close to crossing a red line that Israel has laid down as a trigger for an attack. So the US goes after the cash of Iran's top officials, including the supreme leader himself, that they have stashed in banks all around the world. Then, in June, Hassan Rouhani, a moderate, is overwhelmingly elected president of Iran. He campaigned on repairing ties with the West and negotiating to get the sanctions removed. Rouhani and Obama exchange letters and eventually talk by phone. After this historic chat, Obama tells reporters he believes there is a basis for an agreement. Next, a major breakthrough. Iran agrees to temporarily freeze its entire nuclear program to give the negotiators room to reach a deal. Throughout 2014, Iran agrees step by step to dismantle parts of its program, like shipping the vast amount of its nuclear fuel out of the country. And finally, the big news. The negotiators announced they have hammered out the major framework for a comprehensive deal to roll back Iran's nuclear program and guarantee it can only be used for peaceful purposes. It should be finalized by June 30th, 2015.
The deal was hammered out by the US, Russia, France, the UK, China, Germany, and Iran back in 2015. It followed 9 years of talks and a decade-long standoff, which many viewed at the time as one of the world's most pressing crises. Now, the international nuclear watchdog that's been monitoring Iran's compliance with the deal says Tehran is keeping up its side of the bargain. That includes, for example, shipping enriched uranium to Russia, mothballing thousands of centrifuges, and removing the core from a reactor at a key nuclear facility. Now, certain US officials also back the view that Iran has been good to its word, while their European colleagues say, well, Trump is simply wrong.
Iran is in technical compliance of the agreement.
Iran is not in material breach of the agreement, and I do believe the agreement to date has delayed the development of a nuclear capability by Iran.
RT's Ilya Petrenko now taking a closer look at what could be Donald Trump's reasons to break this deal.
So, Donald Trump's got a problem with what's known as Iran's nuclear deal. Okay, he's not a fan of Iran in the first place. He's confident it's still a nest for terrorists. But is that a good enough reason to basically throw the compromise agreement that required so much diplomatic effort to the floor? I mean, when it comes to sticking to the deal terms, the world agrees. Tehran is behaving. So why the assumption the deal's in jeopardy because of Washington? The House Foreign Affairs Committee chairman explains.
The Tehran regime clearly sees itself as a movement, one that uses ideology and violence to destabilize its neighbors, to threaten others.
Just for the record, that was an American official talking about someone else, promoting ideology and views, using violence in other countries to get what they want. Isn't that a U.S. thing, like the golden rule of their foreign policy that we've seen in action so many times?
And we act to stand united with our allies for peace. By acting now, we are upholding our values, protecting our interests, and advancing the cause of peace.
This nation, in World War and in Cold War, has never permitted the brutal and lawless to set history's course. Now as before, we will secure our nation, protect our freedom, and help others to find freedom of their own.
My fellow Americans, for nearly 7 decades, the United States has been the anchor of global security. The burdens of leadership are often heavy, but the world's a better place because we have borne them.
What a historic background. Looks like Mr. Royce might as well replace the words Tehran regime with the names of American presidents. They were the ones who loved promoting ideology, i.e. democracy, elsewhere. Yeah, interventions are exactly what I'm talking about. Donald Trump is an unpredictable man. When it comes to Iran and the deal, maybe not so much.
Political scientist Kaveh Afrasiabi believes the nuclear deal was always at risk because Donald Trump doesn't understand Iran as a country.
The Iran nuclear deal, it was struck because they managed to keep the issue of building an atomic bomb separated from things like developing ballistic missiles, the militancy of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. Trump putting it all in one box.
Well, all in one box, and even further than that. If you were listening to the first part of the speech, I was struck by his vision of Iran. Looked pretty much that he was stuck in the era of Khomeini. For instance, all what he mentioned about Iran being a rock state, sponsor of terrorism, was true, but that was true 20 years ago. I mean, the hotels in Beirut, and ever since that time, Iran has changed slightly, and it doesn't seem that Trump gets it. Not that the regime has changed its core elements. They are radical people, but take its Prime Minister President Rouhani. He was re-elected a second term, facing hardliners. That was a surprise, but the Iranian people re-elected a rather moderate president, and Trump seems to miss the point in all of that.
President Trump is about to make a major decision involving Iran's nuclear program. He has until the end of this week to determine whether the Western agreement with Iran should be continued, or at least the U.S. involvement in it. Correspondent Rich Edson tells us what's at stake tonight from the State Department.
Sources close to the president say he will likely pass on withdrawing the United States from the Iran nuclear deal as the next deadline approaches, essentially holding together an agreement he says he loathes.
This is one of the worst deals ever made by any country in history. It also gave the regime an immediate financial boost and over $100 billion its government could use to fund terrorism.
Frankly, that deal is an embarrassment to the United States, and I don't think you've heard the last of it. Believe me.
Over the next several days, President Trump must decide whether to continue waiving sanctions against Iran, lifted as part of the 2015 Iran nuclear agreement. Within the week, the administration must also tell Congress whether Iran is complying with the major components of the nuclear deal. In October, the administration, for the first time, refused to certify Iran's compliance, keeping the U.S. in the deal, though giving Congress a greater role in developing Iran's strategy.
The goal is actually to get a better deal, and the way you do that is to create the conditions through more pressure and also to re-govern the way under which the U.S. is a party to the deal.
Sources close to the discussion say Secretary of State Rex Tillerson met today at the White House and this weekend at Camp David with the president to discuss these deadlines, pointing out progress on congressional negotiations. Lawmakers are considering reducing how often the president must make these decisions on waivers and certifications. They're also debating stronger enforcement of the nuclear deal and more measures to penalize Iran's ballistic missile program. These deadlines arrive as there are reports from Iran that it is arresting, torturing, and killing those who've protested across the country. The White House press secretary says Iran should release all political prisoners, adding, quote, Iran's regime claims to support democracy, but when its own people express their aspirations for better lives and an end to injustice, it once again shows its true brutal nature. While the U.S. lobbies allies to support changes to the Iran nuclear deal, European diplomats are meeting tomorrow with Iran. The U.S. allies will reportedly reassure Iran's foreign minister that they remain committed to the deal.
As the deadline for re-endorsing the Iran nuclear deal approaches, the world's once again second-guessing Donald Trump's next move.
Iran is taking over the Middle East.
The US president's repeatedly threatened to tear up the agreement, but so far he's reluctantly kept it alive. It was a landmark moment in international diplomacy. 7 countries signed the agreement at a time of heightened tensions across the region. Some of Iran's neighbours have been talking about a possible military strike against the country. Iran's made no secret of its arsenal of Russian-made ballistic missiles. Israel and Washington's Middle Eastern allies feared it also had an active nuclear weapons program. Iran insisted its nuclear agenda was purely civilian, but under the deal it agreed to end research in return for the partial lifting of sanctions, allowing it to access global financial markets and, crucially, sell its oil. As part of America's commitment to the deal, Congress requires the US president to confirm every 90 days that Iran's upholding its part of the agreement. Trump's recertified the deal several times so far, but things could be about to change. Last October, he announced a new Iran policy.
Iran is not living up to the spirit of the deal. I am announcing a new strategy to address the full range of Iran's destructive actions.
It's a strategy many Iranians believe is motivated simply by Trump's growing support for Israel.
I think under Trump, US and Israeli interests are closely aligned, and I think Trump's main problem with Iran is that it clashes with Israel, for that simple reason. So for that reason, I would also add that should Iran and Israel's relationship improve, which is not on the horizon anytime soon, you would see major changes in the Iran-US relationship as well.
Trump's refusing to recertify the deal until Congress amends it. He's called for sanctions on Iran's Revolutionary Guard, which he described as a corrupt personal terror force of Iran's leader. He also wants to extend time limits on the country's nuclear research and curtail its missile program. But as Congress didn't draw up the deal, it's not down to them to change it. Any alterations it makes with the president would be in breach of the international agreement. It leaves Donald Trump with 2 choices: recertify the deal and keep it alive, reject the deal, violate the agreement, and almost inevitably trigger an international crisis.
Iran says that it's capable of speeding up its nuclear activities, in particular the uranium enrichments, compared to the pre-nuclear deal era.
If the U.S. fails to meet its commitments and does not extend the sanctions waiver, we'll consider it a violation of the nuclear deal. The Islamic Republic has its own actions to take under such circumstances. If the U.S. reneges on its commitments, it should not expect Iran to have the same level of cooperation it has had with the International Atomic Energy Organization over the past 2 years. We have anticipated various measures if the U.S. refrains from signing the suspension of the sanctions by its deadline. We'll take our first action immediately within very few days.
Kemal Bandi also said the Atomic Energy Organization has reported to the country's authorities about its capacity to multiply the pace of nuclear activities. However, he stressed that the scale and the percentage of the nuclear enrichment depend on the authorities' decisions. The U.S. President Donald Trump will announce on Friday that if he certifies the Iranian compliance with the deal known as the JCPOA and extends the sanctions waivers, all other signatories to the deal have called for the deal to be upheld and live on. Jan Ober, founder of transnational.org, joins us from London. So we're anticipating something that hasn't happened yet, but Iran has made its stance very clear. And it says that, we can go back to the pre-nuclear deal era, as they've called it, in terms of their nuclear activities, one of them being uranium enrichment. How do you see the way that the U.S. has so far exerted itself, Iran's stance, and that, of course, comes with numerous times that it has that the IAEA has come out saying that Iran has complied with its obligations?
Yes, and that's a very important point. And secondly, obviously today there's also a clear signal from the European Union that they are fully behind the deal and behind Iran. And with your foreign minister's visit to Moscow today, I think it's very clear also that Russia is behind the deal without any changes, of course. And I assume that China would be there too. So everybody would be on Iran's side and respecting that Iran has lived up to its promises. The only one who would fall out and antagonize the rest of the world and the rest of the powers who signed this deal would be Donald Trump of the United States. And I have a hard time believing that he would. Well, maybe I'm too optimistic, but I have a hard time believing that he would do that on Friday.
Well, you know what's really strange about this is when you talk about Donald Trump and this nuclear deal, it seems like, well, as you said, it seems like he is the only one. I mean, even within the U.S. and within his inner circle, they're trying to save the deal. It's even reported as such that he's going to scrap it unless they give him reason not to.
That's one interpretation. The other interpretation is that one of the very few points where he's consistent compared with his campaign days and his first year in office is his hatred of Iran. I mean, the speech he gave earlier was indicative of that, and he surrounds himself with people who are only for military action, all options on the table and that sort of thing, and accuses Iran of this and that. So I would not be totally surprised, because I'm not sure who's writing his speeches. I'm not sure that it's really something that he says what he thinks himself. But, you know, it's mind-boggling to me on point after point, the United States is isolating itself and antagonizing even its allies and friends in Europe, for instance. So, but I would not exclude the possibility that he will say something on Friday that is meant to be provocative to Iran, and therefore, you know, as a conflict and peace researcher, I would say, don't respond with anything that could give the U.S. a pretext for harder action in the future. You also have internal problems in the country at the moment, but do something that will be respected and carry on the goodwill by those who have the goodwill at the moment.
Thank you for that, Jan Oberg, founder transnational.org from London.
And the focus of today's meeting was on the ongoing work to ensure full and continued implementation of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear deal with Iran, by all parties. The European Union has had and expressed a very clear position on the nuclear deal, as it was stated by the 28 European Union member states ministers already in October last year, and repeated again today. The deal is working. It is delivering on its main goal, which means keeping the Iranian nuclear program in check and under close surveillance. While we have expressed concerns related to other issues, such as development of ballistic missiles and increasing tensions in the region, these issues are outside the scope of the nuclear agreement and are and will be addressed in relevant formats and fora. We also briefly, obviously, discussed internal recent events in Iran.
Thank you very much. I'm really going to just echo, just in conclusion, that I don't think anybody has so far produced a better alternative to the JCPOA as a way of preventing the Iranians from going ahead with the acquisition of a military nuclear capability. I don't think anybody has come up with a better idea, and I think it's incumbent on those who oppose the JCPOA really to come up with that better solution, because we haven't seen it so far.
This closes this press conference.